Welcome to the Chaim Davies Show. I'm your host, Chaim Davies, and in today's episode, I'd like to begin a journey with you in understanding the Torah approach to how we're meant to engage with Judaism in a vibrant and exciting way. And the place I'd like to start with is understanding the role of context within the Jewish perspective. For many of us, if I can speak honestly, mitzvot don't trigger an energy, a fulfillment, or some sort of renewed vitality within us. More often than not, we find ourselves holding that siddur, shaking that lulav, involved in the rite and ritual of Jewish practice, and not really feeling the excitement or the energy that we anticipate mitzvot should be providing us. And so the question for me has always been, why is that? If these are the ways in which we're meant to engage in covenant with God, these are the tools that have been presented to us as a means of getting ourselves in sync and connected with the Almighty in some meaningful and authentic way, then why is it that for so many of us, they appear to do so little? So I found an incredible approach to understanding and answering this question in the writings of the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, one of the great Torah scholars and Kabbalists at the turn of the 18th century. The Ramchal was one of those unique individuals who influenced the trajectory of Jewish history from his time until the present day. And in one of his great works on Jewish philosophy, Derech Hashem, or the Way of God, he sets out the fundamentals of Torah belief and practice concerning God's role in this world, the methods of how he connects with us, and what we know about God's system by which he conducts all of existence. And the Ramchal opens his introduction with a beautiful analogy about two very different experiences. Imagine the experience of finding yourself in a well-tended botanical garden. Every species has been carefully cultivated and arranged according to its natural climate and within a careful color scheme across the entire garden. Unique flora from across the globe have been collected and made accessible in a particular and beautiful way, ultimately to please the visitor, you. Everything has its place. What experience do we undergo in this type of garden? We're at peace. Life is beautiful, bright, clearly arranged, and as we travel the paths of the garden, we're pleased by the entire array and the seamless arrangement of all the details. We enjoy the sense of calm and tranquility, security that the careful structure of the garden provides, and we wind up leaving feeling relaxed and energized and with a positive impression of the whole experience. Continues the Ramchal, contrast that experience with finding yourself in the midst of a densely overgrown jungle. Dry twigs are tangled in complex ways all over the floor. A variety of weeds are growing freely amidst all of the clusters of struggling plant life. The few meager flowers which have fought hard enough to survive their savage neighbors are overcrowded by this forcefully multiplying shrubbery around them. With no easy way to turn, you have to struggle your way through this difficult terrain, fearing what might be behind every shadow. The whole experience provides emotional and physical strain. If you make it through the overgrown mess, you leave exhausted, distressed, and with a negative impression of the whole experience. Explains Ramchal, the same is true with systems of life in general and the experience of Torah to the Jewish people in particular. We can either find ourselves in an overgrown jungle or find ourselves in a beautiful garden. Our lives as a whole require context if we're to feel properly situated in our slice of reality. When we know who we are, where we are, and what we're meant to be doing here, we have the capacity to transform our experience from bewildering and chaotic to meaningful and relevant. For so many of us, the mitzvot of the Torah seem so chaotic, random, disparate. It almost seems as though there's no rhyme or reason behind the system. If we fail to see the context, the overarching theme, we deprive ourselves of the meaning and the vitality which only context can provide. But if we learn to trace truth's pattern from amidst all of our experiences and our encounters with Judaism, we can then reap the enjoyments available to us. Torah can either be recognized as a beautifully arranged, calming garden or mistaken for a catastrophic mess of disparate details. If we're going to recognize Torah and tap into its untold riches, we must learn to see its artistic arrangements and its structure of thought. And as we recognize that breadth and intricacy and beauty within Torah, we then become capable of enjoying all of its experiences within the Torah's garden. The broader and more inclusive our understanding of the context, the brighter each detail can shine. When we have those principles guiding our perspective, we then find ourselves anchored in reality to a greater extent. Now, there may be some who are surprised to be hearing this. Some of us are raised on this notion that the Torah does have some transformative power within it, automatically, and that if we aren't experiencing that light, then there must be something wrong with us, not just with our understanding of the Torah. But the truth is that the Talmud itself tells us there are two completely different ways in which the Torah itself can be experienced. In Tractate Yoma, page 72a, Rabbi Yoshua records a fascinating interpretation of a verse that we commonly recite when we remove the Torah from the Aron. In the book of Dvarim, it says as follows, V'zot HaTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei b'nei Yisrael. This is the Torah which Moshe placed, before the children of Israel. Now, the Talmud says something astounding about the meaning of these words. You see, the word used in the verse to mean placed, sounds exactly like another Hebrew word, sam. But this word means a drug, a medicine, or an elixir, an herbal concoction which can have dramatically different effects depending on the person who's taking it. Now, traditionally, such coincidences within the language of the Torah, two words that sound the same, are seen as intentional and are meant to provide some sort of insight. So the Talmud explains that there is actually a veiled implication within the Torah's words. The Torah acts as a potion upon its recipient. And as with all drugs, the effect can vary significantly depending on an assortment of variables. So the Talmud asserts that Torah's influence on a human being is also relative to the type of person who's absorbing the Torah. In the words of the Talmud, Zacha na'aseh lo sam chayim. If the person who's taking in the Torah is faithful to it, with an understanding of its general meaning and an interest in growing through its guidance, then the Torah acts as an elixir of life to that individual. But lo zacha, if a person does not purify themselves and indulges in the Torah without the proper advanced fortification, na'aseh lo sam hamavet. It becomes for him a potion of death. He finds himself at risk of being poisoned by the very thing which could have brought him life and vitality. And so the Torah is something which can enliven or crush, empower or deaden. And it's up to us to create that space emotionally, mentally, contextually, in order to allow the Torah to have that effect that it's meant to have. And we know the Torah is about choosing life, not death. Moshe implores the Jewish people before his own death that they are to choose carefully, advisedly, between the paths that are laid out before them. Hachaim v'hamavet natati lefanecha. I have placed life and death before you. Ubacharta b'chayim leman tichyeh. You should choose life so that you shall live. The Torah is given to us in order to provide life for us. It's meant to help ripen our potential, refine our character, enliven our experiences, not to crush our feelings or our thinking into blind obedience. And Jewish prayer has actually preserved this idea by referring to the Torah as Torat Chaim, instructions for life. The Torah is a manual, a blueprint for navigating life on the high road. And so when we're presented with these two options, life and death, and the ability for the Torah to give us life, or the possibility of it sapping us of that energy, we recognize we have no option but to attempt to discover how the Torah can be relevant, meaningful, and enlivening to us today. So I do believe that this comes down to context. I think it matters a lot how we frame our orientation towards Torah. I mean, we all know that in every other area of life this is true. When we fail to understand the meaning of details, we zoom out. We look at the bigger picture. We know that a single snapshot of reality can be misleading when it's taken out of context. We understand that words taken out of context of a conversation they're a part of can be completely misunderstood. So if we're going to expect the mitzvot and the Torah to mean anything to us, our first step along this journey needs to be understanding the bigger picture. And so I'd like to embark on a journey together with you today, a journey of understanding the the fundamental context of Judaism. Who is God? What does it mean to be a Jew? What is the relationship between God and the Jewish people? And what place does Torah hold within our minds and our collective national heart? If we can begin to clarify these things together, we'll begin finding a way to allow that vitality, that energy within ourselves. And just as the Ramchal said, that overgrown jungle of our religious experience will become slowly pruned and refined until it too resembles the beautiful botanical garden that we've always dreamed of, a place into which we can enter to find solace, peace, and inner meaning, an experience from which we find ourselves enlivened, invigorated, and ultimately brought to a whole new level of consciousness and a deeper connection with reality. So we need to hear Torah's perspective. We need to understand, how does God portray the Torah's covenant that was entered into by the Jewish people so many thousands of years ago, by the nation standing at the foot of Sinai? And so I think a great place to begin understanding this is where God begins. And I don't mean by that the beginning of the book of Genesis. What I'm talking about is how God prefaces the revelation at Mount Sinai, the moment which forged our national identity into an eternal covenant with God. Because there's an astounding conversation that takes place between Moshe and the Almighty and God, just moments before God reveals himself to the nation at Mount Sinai. And I do believe that it sets the tenor for all subsequent communication to come. Let's take a look at how the Torah frames the revelation at Sinai. So we have this moment in Exodus chapter 19. Moshe ascends to the summit of Mount Sinai. God appears to him and tells Moshe that he has an important message for the Jewish people to hear before things go any further. Ko tomar levet Yaakov v'taged lebnei Yisrael. The following is what you must convey to the house of Jacob, to the entire house of Israel. Our tradition maintains that these words imply that God's message must reach man and woman alike. Every person should receive the following message in a way which is most effective for them. Now, we might have assumed that God's message to the people would be about commandments. Jews, your lives are about to change forever. There will be hundreds of obligations which fill every moment of your lives. Be prepared to commit yourself to a life of strict religious adherence, bound by a slew of consequences for each move you make. But instead, we read a different story. Instead, we hear God providing a different ambiance, a different context, a different way of relating to everything else that will follow. Rather than discussing law, tradition, or allegiance, God opens up with context, talking about where we're from and where we're going. And he says the most beautiful things to the people of Israel. God tells Moshe to convey the following message to the Jewish people. You've seen everything that I've done for you until now, how I brought you out of slavery on the wings of eagles, and I brought you here to me. Ve'ata, and now, here is what I ask. Im shamoah tishma'u bekoli, if you will listen to my voice, ushmartem et briti, and you will caringly treasure my covenant that I am forging with you, then vehiyitem li sigula mikol ha'amim. You will be to me a treasure from amongst all the other nations of the world. Ki li kol ha'aretz, for after all, the entire world is mine. If you will be willing to open your hearts to connecting with me, then you will be a treasure to me from amongst everything I've created. V'atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim. Then you will be a kingdom of priests, a nation of royalty, v'goy kadosh, and a holy people, a sacred people, a special people, something unique, something that I've always desired. Ele hadvarim asher tedaber b'nei Israel. These are the words, Moshe, which you are to convey to the children of Israel. Comment the sages, no more and no less. It is this that provides the setting for the receiving of the Torah. Is this a message about religion? Is this something which calls us to a blind faith? Sure, there's talk of covenant, of course. That's what's about to take place. But what's the sensation that flows through this entire communication from God to the Jewish people? It's love. Don't you see, says God, how I've taken such tender care of you? How I took you out gracefully from the fiery pits of slavery in Egypt, as I tore the country apart bit by bit for the way they treated you there? And how I brought you here to me, And now, what do I ask? That you become my treasure. Yes, that you commit yourself to me, to a loving involvement with the creator of the universe. That you partner with me in carrying this project of life forward. And if you do that, if you can open your hearts and your minds to connect with me in a meaningful and authentic way, there will be nothing more precious to me than what you are. Moshe delivers this message to the Jewish people, and their reaction is unanimous. Kol asher diber Adonai na'aseh. Everything which God commands us to do, we will listen and we will perform, because they understood that what they were getting involved in was the greatest covenant in all of human history, that they were about to partake in a commitment between themselves and the creator of the universe, the one who controls everything, and it was going to be predicated on love. I believe that this is the first and most important step in understanding the context of Judaism. Torah is about forging a loving relationship with God. It's about choosing life, but choosing life isn't about maintaining a heartbeat alone. Choosing life is about being true to who you are. It's about embracing the higher calling. It's about discovering that within yourself lies a dormant desire for connecting with the transcendental, for reaching out in loving commitment to the creator of everything. This was the way that God meant the stage to be set before the Jewish people could accept the Torah. And if it's true for the nation at large, it's true for us today. The first step along the journey to a closer and more intimate bond with Jewish identity, with the Torah, begins with a recognition of the underlying love that binds the nation of Israel with the creator of the world. The orientation that our life is not haphazard, that our commitment is not dry and cold, but rather predicated on that deep bond of commitment and participation in a shared narrative between us and the creator of the universe. But what's truly amazing is that this love became the nature of the covenant itself. You see, when God said, "You will safeguard my covenant," that covenant itself manifests in a journey. We know this because the traditional word for Jewish law, the way that we're meant to practice and behave, integrate into our actions, the instructions of the Torah, the word for this is halakha, which literally means to walk, to travel, to journey. The steps of the covenant are embodied within the daily practice of Jewish life. Each and every step along that journey is meant to be founded upon, imbued with that underlying love, which began so many thousands of years ago. And as the great psychologist Erich Fromm wrote in his book, The Art of Loving, love is an activity, not a passive effect. And so make no mistake, it is a journey. There are steps to be taken, progress to be made, potential to be actualized. And at each step, we discover more about ourselves, more about God, and more about the intimate love that exists between the two of us. And so I'm looking forward to continuing along this journey together with you. And as we continue to explore, I hope that we can uncover more of the stepping stones of Judaism's journey, which can ultimately bring us to a place where the experience of Judaism doesn't weigh us down, but lifts us, energizes us, and brings us towards an authentic Jewish experience, one which is filled with that love and passion and fulfillment which began so many thousands of years ago. I'm Chaim Davies, and this is the Chaim Davies Show. See you all next time. I hope you enjoyed that segment of the Chaim Davies Show. If you did, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell or follow our podcast so you can stay up to date on all our future content.